And it's BBOR Blackbox Online Radio coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Well, today is Wednesday, and on Wednesdays this year, I've been doing a regular segment about the Texarkana Moonlight murders from 1946. And I really wanted to do an episode that could kind of encapsulate the whole story, or as much of it as we possibly can in this brief amount of time. The Texarkana Moonlight murders were a series of crimes that were committed by an unidentified perpetrator known simply as the Phantom Killer. And it absolutely remains a mystery to this day. His identity is unknown. The Phantom Killer operated in the town of Texarkana, which is situated on both the Arkansas and the Texas borders. There's a Texas side and an Arkansas side. The first attack from the Phantom Killer occurred on February 22nd of 1946, when Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LaRae were attacked at more or less a lover's lane. They were parked in a secluded area, and we aren't exactly sure if there was some type of connection between the victims and the perpetrator, but what seems like a more established fact is that Robert Hollis and Mary Jean LaRae were both able to survive this ordeal, and they said that the perpetrator was wearing this type of hooded mask that looked like a pillowcase with the eyes cut out and even a hole for the mouth. Although in many illustrations of the Phantom Killer, we do not see always the mouth hole, but almost all depictions of this killer say that it's somewhat like a pillowcase for a mask. And this is the true birth of the Phantom Killer. The name would come much later on in 1946, but it is this particular detail, I think, that has allowed us to truly remember these crimes. And of course, rest in peace to all of the victims. But I think that it's definitely piqued people's curiosity about this element of mystery that has been added to these very tragic events. The next crime committed by the Phantom Killer would result in a double murder. Instead of having both victims survive, both victims would pass away. And this was the murder of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, which took place on March 24th of 1946. So a very big time gap for the Phantom Killer's activities, because that's almost more than a month. And the Phantom Killer isn't exactly a typical serial killer, because the crimes are going to stop at the beginning of May. There's only a 2.5 month period of activity for the entire crime spree. And in many ways, the Phantom Killer is a spree killer as opposed to some type of serial killer reign of terror that goes on for 8 years or 10 years or 15 years, which is definitely more typical behavior. But there are no witness descriptions of the perpetrator because both of the victims did not survive. Now, about 3 weeks later, on the 14th of April, 1946, the Phantom Killer committed another double murder. And this was the most famous crime, I believe so anyway, that has been attributed to the Phantom Killer, and the murders of Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin. I think there are two big reasons why there is this fascination with the murder of Betty Jo Booker. Firstly, there's an additional detail. They weren't simply sitting in a car in a secluded area. Betty Jo Booker was a musician and she played the saxophone. And after the murder, or at some time during the attack, Betty Jo Booker's saxophone was taken from the car and thrown over a fence on the right side of the road. This would be a detail that was used to incriminate a suspect, I repeat, suspect, later on, and his name was Yule Swinney. His wife provided the detail that the saxophone was thrown over the fence on the right side of the road, and they're thinking this is a piece of privileged information. Only the real killer or the police should have known that. If his wife knew that, then he most likely confessed to his wife, therefore he must be the Phantom Killer. But that doesn't necessarily prove anything because, firstly, someone could just make that up and get lucky, or she could have learned about it from other police officers, her attorney, and I do give credit to Jeremy Kennington for a lot of his observations on that, just citing the source. The next reason, though, why I think this is there's this fascination with the murder of Betty Jo Booker, it was because she was a musician. And Yule Swinney might be the prime suspect, but there's another suspect in the case named Duty Tennyson. He's often referred to as H.B. Tennyson, and he was also a musician. Betty Jo Booker played the saxophone, and Duty Tennyson played the trombone. And it's a different element of curiosity that I think a lot of people have about was there some type of connection between the Phantom Killer and music, but both the victims did not survive. Then, on May 3rd of 1946, the Phantom Killer would do something completely different and go after Virgil Starks and Katie Starks in their home. Virgil Starks was reported to have been sitting in an armchair when he was shot. At first, he was listening to a radio program and then reading the newspaper when he was shot with a different type of firearm. In the first crime, the attack on Hollis and LaRae, the victims weren't even shot, they were bludgeoned. In the second crime and the third crime, the victims were shot with a .32 caliber pistol, but with the murder of Virgil Starks, he was shot with a .22. Does that give us some food for thought in any particular direction? The Phantom Killer would also try to murder Virgil Starks' wife, Katie, but she was able to evade the killer's path and get to safety, and someone even fired a gun into the night sky to try and scare off any type of perpetrator. But an interesting detail is that Katie Starks did not get a good look at the perpetrator at all. Not only could she not tell was he Caucasian or African American, she wasn't even able to tell if he had been wearing the hooded costume or not. She didn't see anything. So that also creates some room for suspicion. And that brings us ultimately to the end of the Phantom Killer's crimes. There is this stretch of activity that goes for 2.5 months, 10 weeks, and in a lot of the crimes, a lot of the timeline of the crimes, you will hear people say that the Phantom Killer is operating once every 2 weeks. He committed 5 murders over a span of 10 weeks, so that's a crime once every 2 weeks, right? No, not really, because as I said, there was a month from the attack on Hollis and LaRae to the second crime, which was the Phantom Killer's first double murder, and then it's about 3 weeks to the next attack, and then also about, let's see, just over 2 weeks from the murder of Betty Jo Booker to the murder of Virgil Starks. So 4 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 weeks. What do you think is going on? Do you think that this is a single perpetrator, or do you think that these are unrelated murders that have been stitched together in people's imagination? And I would love to read your responses in the comment section down below, and as always, you can like and subscribe to this channel, and you can always support this show via BuyMeACoffee.com. There's a link to that in the description box, and anybody who makes a contribution or donation will get a shout out on Monday, and every Monday here on Black Box Online Radio is Zodiac Monday. Now, I've previously talked about the psychologist and Dr. Anthony LaPalla, who made a bold statement saying that these crimes are completely consistent with a single perpetrator, because this is exactly what someone would do if they were trying to avoid getting caught. And the reasons why is that after committing 3 crimes where the victims are seated in automobiles and they are more or less in lover's lane settings, even if intimacy isn't always taking place, then person is going to deviate from that pattern on the 4th crime, because that's what everybody is expecting him to do. Oh, well, we need to look at lover's lanes. People shouldn't be off sitting in the dark in wooded areas in their car. Well, the killer's going to be thinking, I'm going to do something different so people can't figure out what I'm going to do, changing the pattern to avoid getting caught. And that's why Virgil Starks was attacked. But there was a different type of firearm used for 2 of the crimes, and in one of the crimes the victims were not shot at all. And then the killer deviates from using a .32 caliber to a .22 caliber. The evidence to suggest that it was a single perpetrator is that this was just simply somebody who knew something about firearms, using the 32 caliber pistol up close when he was being in the face and confrontational with victims, and using the 22 caliber gun, which may have been a rifle, when the victims were at a much greater distance because the killer has to shoot through Virgil Starks' window, and it would have been easier to aim a 22 caliber rifle instead of using the 32 caliber pistol. And I think those are some reasonable statements. And Anthony LaPalla was a doctor, and I'm not, and he was also around during the contemporary times of that era, and I was not. But the evidence that suggests that these were either unconnected crimes or there were multiple killers is firstly, there was only one sighting of the hooded pillowcase mask that was worn by the killer, and that was on an attack, during an attack where both the victims survived. Then it seems quite likely that the same person murdered Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin, as well as murdering Griffin and Moore during those attacks, although they happened in a different order, if they were indeed linked via ballistics. But with the murder of Virgil Starks, I'm not really seeing a very large connection to the Phantom Killer. Different gun, different pattern, no sighting of the hooded serial killer. And is it not possible that other murders happened in Texarkana around a similar time for a different reason? And that's even an alternative theory with the murder of Virgil Starks that is suggesting that there were multiple perpetrators because someone could have been trying to pass off the crime as that of the Phantom Killer. And you might be thinking, well, why go after Virgil Starks and Katie Starks? That could have been a personal vendetta. There could have been a motive for going after one of them or both of them, a revenge killing, and thinking that the Phantom Killer would be blamed. So I think that there is some type of evidence on both sides, and you can weigh in the comment section down below. What do you think is more plausible? Was there a single killer or were there multiple perpetrators? Now, one thing that is often very frequently discussed about the Phantom Killer is that he was very intelligent. Whoever this person was, he didn't seem like someone who was not very smart. And I can see where people are coming from. And what I like to say about the Phantom Killer is that he seemed like someone who was very thoughtful, very premeditated, but he wasn't meticulous. And there's a certain degree of planning that went into these crimes, but not a lot. I mean, the costume was very, very basic, very rough, not a sophisticated costume at all. The Phantom Killer was also committing very confrontational crimes, practically getting into fistfights with victims. I mean, you could even say that he was. I mean, he bludgeoned the first two victims, and Jimmy Hollis was attacked by the Phantom Killer, and he was beaten, and his skull was fractured. So this is a killer that doesn't seem to mind getting his hands dirty, but it also goes to show you if murder was his primary objective, he didn't do a very good job of that because three of the victims survived. Jimmy Hollis, Mary Jean LeRae, and Katie Starks. So that really goes to show you that the crimes were committed in somewhat of a sloppy way, maybe somewhat intelligent, but definitely not of a brilliant mind when he's trying to focus on committing murders. And that almost goes to show you, was murder even the primary objective, or was this somebody who was getting off on bringing the terror to the town of Texarkana? Someone who just wanted to create the image of fear and the ideas of terror, or just having this type of phantom killer persona and driving fear into the hearts of the citizens of this particular town. That, I think, is a more defendable case because it just goes to show you that it's about fueling this person's own excitement as opposed to actually committing the crimes. But the reason why the crimes are committed is because that was the way to create the excitement in the first place. And if you want to challenge me on any of these things, you can weigh in the comment section down below. But this also brings up a very particular question. Why would the Phantom Killer stop after only 4 attacks or 5 murders? Was he too scared of getting caught? Was he bothered that they brought in a high-profile Texas Ranger named Lone Wolf Gonzalez? And by the way, if you tune in next week to Black Box Online Radio, I will be doing a book discussion on the biography of Lone Wolf Gonzalez. So, as I said, like, subscribe, and you can follow along with all of these true crime discussions. But I also want to know what you think about why the Phantom Killer would stop committing these crimes. I tend to think if there was a single perpetrator, perhaps he moved to a different location. And I think that there's a reasonable case to make that he would have skipped town and he has committed his terrible deeds, and maybe he went on to commit crimes somewhere else. Another possibility that is almost always discussed with these unsolved serial killer mysteries is the perpetrator could have gone to jail for an unrelated crime, and nobody connected the dots. And you really have to tune in for that book discussion because there's a theory in here talking about how the authorities most likely knew who the Phantom Killer was, but insufficient evidence. And to the credit of, I shouldn't say that, but the way the crimes were committed, the Phantom Killer didn't leave an enormous amount of evidence behind, but there are fingerprints, and famously, a palm print. But there's also a couple complications, because there were numerous confessions to these crimes. Even Yul Swinney, the prime suspect, would give indirect confessions, saying when he was arrested for stealing a car, "Oh, you want me for more than stealing cars? I'm going to be getting the chair." I absolutely do not believe that that is anything indicative of being the Phantom Killer. I think that people are taking those types of small sentences. You've got me for more than stealing cars. You want me for more than stealing cars. And they're just connecting the dots in their own mind. With Duty Tennyson, the other previously mentioned suspect, he confessed to the crimes when he committed suicide in 1948. And he also left behind some puzzles and riddles for the police to solve, and even had this little contraption with a mechanism that you had to solve the code to open it, and the police didn't want to be bothered with some type of lockbox code, so they forced it open. And I just don't think that Duty Tennyson was the Phantom Killer either, because even though he confessed to the crimes, allegedly, he had a history of making up other stories, and the fact that he's just leaving behind riddles and clues for people to solve after he had killed himself only suggests that he was somebody who liked to play games. He liked to tell wild stories. He was deceitful, and it hardly sounds like a legitimate deathbed confession. Instead, it just sounds like someone who wants to toy with people from beyond the grave because that was all he knew how to do. And that goes to show you that, I mean, it's possible that either Yul Swinney or Duty Tennyson were the Phantom Killer, but I do not like either one of them as a suspect. And I really don't want to be somebody who is just latching onto the multiple killers theory with anything, because with the Zodiac Killer, I've talked about it in the past. Maybe not so much now. With Jack the Ripper, absolutely, I think there were multiple killers involved with that, or at least the majority of my brain tells me to. With the Axeman of New Orleans, absolutely, I think there were multiple killers in that operation. They were linked together through a few pieces of circumstantial evidence. And with the Phantom Killer, there's somewhat of a defendable case that, yes, this hooded serial killer went out to go after Mary Jean LeRae and Jimmy Hollis, but he wasn't even trying to murder them because he had every opportunity to do so if it is true that Jimmy Hollis was beaten with a gun and Mary Jean LeRae was even assaulted with the gun in her own way. Don't want to get too graphic on that. But the killer didn't do that. Now, that could have been one person, and then there was a double murder that took place, and then another thrill killing that took place, and that those are an unconnected set of crimes, and that that person isn't even trying to create the image of the Phantom Killer. Instead, they're just going after people who are in vulnerable areas because maybe they thought they would rob the victims and they were jealous of people at lovers' lanes, and it was just criminal behavior on overdrive. And the murder of Virgil Starks was just a completely unrelated crime, either a thrill kill or a personal revenge killing, or there's some type of ulterior motive. I can comprehend the multiple killers theory in the Phantom Saga, but that doesn't mean that's what actually happened, and I think this one will still remain a mystery. Based on everything that I've shared so far, what makes more sense to you? Do you agree with Dr. LaPala that this was all just one person who was targeting lovers' lanes, perhaps somewhat intelligent but not a genius? He went after couples and he went after heterosexual lovers, then deviated from the plan because he didn't want to get caught and he wanted to do something different to make himself appear unpredictable? Or do you agree with the multiple killers arrangement and that people just began to believe that these crimes were connected in somewhat of a untrue way? And also, what do you think about the suspects, Yule Swinney or Duty Tennyson? Please weigh in the comments section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you over there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.